Nikol and Natalie's crash course. Today we will discuss the evolution of civil rights. We will focus on the changes of African Americans and women. There's much to cover, so let's begin. We'll call her back later. It's just Beyonce, no biggie.
Now that I think about Beyonce, isn't she just marvelous? What a goddess. It's just tragic that women in the past history didn't have such a strong female influence to follow like her. You see, back then we women were not recognized as powerful, fearless, and independent women. Back then we were only seen as mothers, wives, and housekeepers. Tragic. After years of fighting this stereotype, women were able to evolve into something more than what we were labeled for. One of the major pushes towards our rights was the 19th Amendment, which granted us the right to vote. From there, we were able to climb our way to equality. This was very visible during World War II, when women were given the chance to prove that they could be just as productive as men. After years of fighting this stereotype, women were able to evolve into something more than what we were labeled for. One of the major pushes towards our rights was the 19th Amendment, which granted us the right to vote. From there, we were able to climb our way to equality. This was very visible during World War II, when women were given the chance to prove they could be just as productive as men. Over 6 million women had entered the workforce for the first time, boosting the percentage of women in the total workforce to 35%. Most of the jobs were in defense plants, waitressing, clerking, and domestic service. But women were also getting involved in journalism and other professional professions. Later on in the 1950s, the role of the homemaker and mother was glorified into popular magazines, movies, and TV programs. Time magazine described the homemaker as the key figure in all suburbia, the thread that weaves between family and community, the keeper of the suburban dream. Thankfully, we were getting more recognition for the marvelous and hard work we did. But as amazing as the recognition was, the woman at the time was still unhappy with their roles and often felt isolated, bored, and unfulfilled. That is why by 1960, almost 40% of mothers with children between ages 6 and 17 held paying jobs. Although increasing numbers of women attended four-year colleges and generally received little financial, academic, or psychological encouragement to pursue their dreams, it wasn't enough to stop women. Women continued to pursue equality with confidence that was passed on to the future generations. You see, as soldiers returned from World War II and settled, there was an explosion in the population, which is known as the baby boom. At the height of the baby boom in 1957, one American infant was born every 7 seconds. It's crazy to think about, but many of women that were born then continue to fight for equality and rights, and making it possible for us to be where we are now.
Today, women have made a tremendous amount of progress with their rights and influence in society. Not only do we continue to take steps towards equality on a daily basis, but we accomplish goals that women in the 1950s could never imagine would be possible. Now, there are women who are international superstars spreading their influence and power across the globe. There are women who are becoming doctors, politicians, corporate business leaders, scientists, and even presidential candidates. People like Beyonce, who spread positivity towards women's rights on a daily basis, and Hillary Clinton, who make huge steps towards changing the views of close-minded people about women, are the essential figures that keep the movement of women's rights alive today. There's also been a lot of progress with women in education. Over 30.2% of women graduated with a bachelor's degree last year. Today, women earn 90 cents to the man's dollar compared to 1980 when they only earned 67 cents to the dollar.
I knew you'd be back for more. So, let's change gears and now talk about how African Americans were able to come so far. You see, as many of us know, and we have learned in our past history classes, African Americans have gone through a very rough road into getting their equality in civil rights. But that all changed during the 1950s. African Americans began to make significant strides towards the reduction of racial discrimination and segregation. Inspired by the African American civil rights movements, many other minorities also began to develop a deeper political awareness and a voice. What gave many African Americans hope was when President Johnson pushed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and sex, and granted the federal government new powers to enforce its provisions. Unfortunately, the journey towards equality was farther than it seemed. Even with the new act, segregation existed, and it made the fight to equality much harder. During the 1980s, a number of other court decisions and state laws severely limited African American rights. For example, in 1990, Louisiana passed a law requiring railroads to provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races. Sadly, the Supreme Court ruled that the separate but equal law did not violate the 14th Amendment, and it was left as it was. But you see, it gets worse, because in the South, the Jim Crow laws were just passed. The laws forbid marriage between blacks and whites and established many other restrictions on social and religious contact between the races. There were separate schools as well as separate streetcars, waiting rooms, railroad coaches, elevators, witness stands, and public restrooms. The facilities provided for blacks were always inferior to those for whites. Thanks to the NAACP, a group which fought to end segregation, and Charles Hamilton Hudson, a Howard University law professor who served as the chief legal counsel for the NAACP, and Thurgood Marshall, there was a very big advancement in the end of segregation. Their hard work led to the Brown versus Board of Topeka, which gave 8-year-old Linda Brown the opportunity to attend a white elementary school 4 blocks from her house, rather than attending the all-black elementary school that was 21 blocks away from her home. That success case led to others such as Little Rock 9, in which African American students had volunteered to integrate Little Rock Central High School. Although the cases created a lot of controversy and angered many Americans, African Americans were making their statement and were not backing down. It began to look brighter for African Americans every day because after the Little Rock 9 incident, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. The law gave the Attorney General greater power over school desegregation. It also gave the federal government jurisdiction or authority over violations of African American voting rights. And you can't forget about Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King, who were two extremely influential African Americans that both were advocates for equality and the end of discrimination. As most of us know, Rosa Parks was a seamstress and a NAACP officer who took a seat in the front row of the colored section of a Montgomery bus and refused to give up her seat. On the other hand, Martin Luther King was a pastor of the Diox Avenue Baptist Church who fought for civil rights in a peaceful and intelligent manner. Their efforts, as well as many others, led into sit-ins in which African American protesters sat down at segregated lunch counters and refused to leave until they were served. It also led to Freedom Summer, in where civil rights groups recruited college students and trained them in a non-violent resistance to help achieve voting rights for all. Because of Freedom Summer, Congress finally passed Johnson's Voting Rights Act of 1965, which tripled the amount of African American votes, which is huge. Finally, Congress passed the most important civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, including the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which ended discrimination in housing. After school segregation ended, the number of African Americans who finished high school and went to college increased significantly. This in turn led to better jobs and business opportunities. Another accomplishment of the civil rights movement was to give African Americans greater pride in their racial identity. Many African Americans adopted African-influenced styles and probably displayed symbols of African history and culture. College students demanded new Black Studies programs so they could study African American history and literature. In the entertainment world, the color bar was lowered as African Americans began to appear more frequently in movies and television shows and commercials. You see, that is where it starts to grow and it starts to show how life has improved for African Americans. Now I'm going to pass it on to my good old colleague, Natalie Ranelli, so she could explain how African Americans' lives have changed today since then.
Civil rights for African Americans have made a lot of advances in society. However, they still have a long way to go. African Americans no longer endure slavery and are seen as equals just as everyone else. Although they are treated as equals in regards to education and living conditions, there is still a lot of progress to be made. For example, in 1970, the number of black elected officials was at 1,500, whereas today it's at 10,500. Also, in 1963, the annual net income for a family was $22,000, whereas today it's $40,000. In the 1960s, about 40% of the African American population was in poverty, whereas today it went down to 27%. All in all, the efforts of people who have fought for civil rights have paid off a lot, but there is still a lot of progress that can be made.